Welcome back to the Bottom Line Upfront, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt, and today we have Stefano, Chief Intelligence Officer at Artorias, and he's going to be leading us through the third segment of the Cartel Corner.
Yes, thank you, Matt, for having me. I'm Stefano. I'm the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias, and I'm also the owner of the All Source News X account, formerly known as Twitter. And I cover Mexican cartels. Will be the second time I'm here, and I'm very excited to kind of provide a deep dive on Mexican cartels with everybody. So thank you again, Matt, for having me.
So one of the things that I think we need to address first is this foreign terrorist organization designation that the Trump admin has put in place. Can you speak to that and expand on that?
Absolutely. So, the Trump administration signed President Trump actually in the shortly after he was inaugurated president. He directed the State Department to designate Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. It was part of an executive order he signed. There was the executive order said basically, identify Mexican cartels to designate as foreign terrorist organization, and in addition to Tren de Aragua and MS-13. Those two were specifically listed. For those who don't know, Tren de Aragua is a very violent prison gang out of Venezuela that has really spread its reach across the Western Hemisphere. I know now lately there's been a lot more in the U.S. news. Their presence in the United States is not as large as comparative to other South American countries like Colombia, Chile, Peru. In Mexico, we don't really see that much Tren de Aragua. That they don't have a very significant presence in Mexico, and they do have a presence though in the United States. So Tren de Aragua and then MS-13. We've had Austin before, who in the previous segment of Cartel Corner kind of provided a great summary and history of MS-13. Those two gangs were already listed in the executive order. The executive order then for the Mexican cartel piece directed the State Department under Marco Rubio to kind of provide an updated list of which Mexican cartels would be designated foreign terrorist organizations. The two big ones that were clear that they were going to get FTO designated without a doubt. It was going to be the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel. If you look at the Treasury Department and the OFAC, the Office for Foreign Asset Control. That's the main office within the Treasury Department that kind of manages sanctions. There's only two Mexican cartels that they consider to be transnational criminal organizations, TCOs, and that's the Sinaloa cartel and CGNG, the Jalisco New Generation cartel. All other Mexican cartels are just kind of referred to as drug trafficking organizations. So with that in mind, it was pretty clear that the Sinaloa cartel and the CGNG were going to be listed. And then everything else was kind of up for speculation. In the meantime, before the list was updated, we did see a significant increase along the border, the US-Mexican border, of intelligence assets doing collections. And the area that they were collecting on, specifically in Southeast Texas, really put into focus the Gulf Cartel and the Northeast Cartel. When the State Department released the list, the drug cartels that were listed were the Sinaloa Cartel, Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the Gulf Cartel, the Northeast Cartel, the United Cartel, and La Nueva Familia Michoacana, the Michoacan family. That was a very broad set of lists of the FTO designation and the cartels that were listed. I think it's important to highlight that, for example, the Sinaloa Cartel and the Gulf Cartel, really for kind of all intents and purposes now, they're not unitary groups anymore. They've been fractured, and there's factions, and they actually have, the Sinaloa Cartel has a very violent civil war. The Gulf Cartel had up to last month a very violent civil war that they kind of have a ceasefire. And so in the Gulf Cartel, the two main factions that are fighting each other that kind of claim the banner of the Gulf Cartel is the Metros. They're based out of Reynosa, Tamaulipas, and then Grupo Escorpión, the Scorpion Group, out of Matamoros. And so those kind of obviously the terrorist designation, they're just lumping them all together. And then if you look at the Sinaloa cartel, the two main ones obviously would be Los Chapitos and the Mayo Zambada or Mayito Flaco now organizations. The FTO designation kind of was very broad. I think a lot of people were kind of surprised by it. But one of the things that, is kind of to me almost a contradictory aspect of this is when the list was released, and I saw specifically the United Cartel and La Familia Michoacana. One of the questions I had is there's another cartel that's out of Ciudad Juarez, which borders El Paso, Texas, very active in the state of Chihuahua, called La Línea, which is the basically the Juarez cartel, or now how they refer to themselves, the new cartel of Juarez. They were not FTO designated, which was kind of surprising, because if you're going to have basically almost all the cartels that have a significant control along the border, being the Gulf Cartel, the Northeast Cartel, or as their abbreviation is called, the CDN, the Sinaloa Cartel, that has a huge presence on the border. There's kind of this huge area that there's this gap where the La Linea that controls a significant portion of the U.S. Mexican border, specifically in West Texas. They weren't listed FTO, and the question is, well, if the United Cartel was listed and La Familia Michoacana was listed, was they're not really active in the border, why wasn't La Linea, kind of added into this? And to be honest, nobody has really given a clear explanation of why they were not added. I mean, we can speculate. I think there might be a misunderstanding that maybe La Linea, which is now this Juarez cartel, there's still this impression that because the La Linea used to historically be kind of the enforcers of the Juarez cartel, and then when the weakening of the Juarez cartel, La Linea kind of took over. But for all intents and purposes, now La Linea is the Juarez cartel, or the new Juarez cartel. But there may be some lag between kind of how the State Department analyzed it and viewed La Linea. But I think that's the one area that's kind of glaring to me, that was not very specified. But besides that, I mean, these were very broad FTOs, and they basically hit, except the Juarez cartel, every major Mexican cartel active in Mexico right now.
Yeah, I mean, my speculation would be that the admin doesn't actually have that deep of an understanding of these organizations. But one of the things that we hear about quite often in security studies, or when looking at organizations, is that one man's terrorist is another man's rebel. So can you expand a little bit, like the difference between criminal organizations, terrorist organizations, rebels, militia, and whether or not you actually think these organizations are terrorist organizations, or are they really just motivated by money?
So I think, I mean, to kind of plug in the podcast names, bottom line up front, these groups are basically money grabbing organizations. I mean that's their sole primary focus. Um, you do run into instances where some of these groups have a, for example, historically, and they're still kind of prevalent. They're not as huge as they used to be, but historically, the Knights Templars, which were very active in Michoacan, and again, they're still there. They're still very in a much smaller form than what they were in the early 2010s. The Knights Templars historically actually had a very religious component, like this kind of like cult-like ideology, and so you do kind of see some of these organizations might do it, so and in broad aspects, especially in their messaging and propaganda campaign, they do have aspects of, okay, do we have situations where these cartels are actively sending a local political message, right? But for the grand scheme of things, when we're analyzing Mexican cartels, they're driven by money. I mean, that's without a doubt and without a question. But I think it's important to highlight, though, that the tactics they use and how cartels operate do fall within the realm of insurgent groups, rebel groups, and even their propaganda and their execution videos are very much in line with politically ideological terrorist organizations, right? I mean, if you look at Mexican cartels, a perfect example is execution videos. You know, you can actually analyze Mexican cartel execution videos by, for example, their sophistication, by the depth that they have, by the manner that they do it. Is it a very crude, brutal execution video? Or is it something that, although has a level of brutality, clearly shows a different level of sophistication, right? And I think that's important to highlight. I mean, when we look at how cartels operate in Mexico, and I think it's important to highlight that in Mexico, there's not such a thing as a cartel war, one cartel war. When you're analyzing Mexico, it's various cartel conflicts happening at the same time, and that impacts different states. That some of them have overlap, and some of them have nothing to do with one or the other, right? When you look at the various conflicts impacting Mexico and the cartel violence, it's not a something like if you would look at the West, let's say in the United States, let's say, violence areas in urban cities like LA, Chicago, New York. This isn't where, you would have a law enforcement agency doing an investigation, dealing with gangs in these towns or cities, right? Or in France or in Spain, et cetera. What a lot of times what you actually see in Mexico is more akin to, and I've talked about this in the previous episode that I was on, is I mean, these are, non-state actors operating as rebel or insurgent groups with some varying degrees of sophistication, either utilizing drones. We do see them operate in up armored vehicles, locally manufactured up armored vehicles. In Mexico, they call them monstruos or monsters. They're just kind of like these Mad Max vehicles. They do have these tactics, and even and specifically CG&G specifically, a lot of the messaging that they try to send out either directly or indirectly is that this idea that CG&G or other cartels are kind of this professionalized military force that I do believe gets split over into analysis in the United States. And I think it's important to highlight that, yes, cartels are very militarized. And in many instances, and if you talk to Mexican soldiers, they'll tell you, and a lot of times, the Mexican military might even run into situations where they're outgunned, but they're not a professional military force, right? The Mexican military is a lot more professional. It's a lot more adept. It's a lot more trained, and Mexican cartels are not. Um, and again, I think that's something though that when we're analyzing these cartels is that the messaging they sent is that kind of this rebel-esque insurgent group that not necessarily in some you have to analyze each cartel differently, but in a lot of ways they're not directly challenging state control or authority, but rather they're trying to challenge more of their rival cartels. But it's this weird conundrum where you're analyzing in this FTO designation, like, is there a political motive that drives cartels? And for the most part, no. But the tactics they use and how they implement their objectives do fall within the tactics of other terrorist organizations and other insurgents. And I think that's something that we're seeing in the Western Hemisphere as a whole, where gangs and these cartels, mafias, and organized crimes are adapting tactics more akin to a political insurgency rather than what we're more used to historically seeing related to these groups of just normal criminal groups operating in an urban setting and kind of running away from law enforcement. No, these groups are militarizing and they're adapting their capabilities to the 21st century.
Well, and I think a lot of what you're seeing from these organizations, it reminds me of some of these organizations like JNIM who are operating in the Sahel, where yes, there's this larger motivation where they are looking at sort of trying to implement their version of Islam, but at the same time, they are putting in place taxes and levies and tolls on people who are trying to travel through the regions which they have control over. And it's not explicitly terrorism, but they are trying to fund themselves. And I think we're seeing something very similar with the organizations in Mexico. And even if it's not straight up political violence, they are trying to gain control over various regions of Mexico. And to me, that is inherently political to some extent. But so what I would ask you is what are some of the misconceptions about uh, retaliation that we're seeing from the cartels?
So let me address your point because I think and then I'll answer your question. But I think one of the things that you mentioned there is very important to highlight. And it's this idea of, okay, let's compare. Like, I think that's example of JNIM in Mali and in the Sahel is a key example, right? Because you're right. Where do we? The Mexican cartels also do the same. They do extortions, taxes, levies, etc. But plaza bosses. That's where we all see sometimes a lot of the violence. It's the plaza bosses control the plaza. Basically, is the city or the town. They control it, and any commerce, both illicit or licit, both legal or illegal, they kind of have a fee in that, right? So even in the illicit market, you'll have independent groups operating there, independent criminal groups. So let's look at, let's say, Ciudad Juarez with that borders El Paso, right? From a human smuggling aspect or even illicit drugs, the Juarez control controls the plaza. And so if you have a group, an independent criminal organization that focuses on drug trafficking, they have to pay a fee to operate in that plaza, right? Or even human smugglers, because even a lot of the migration into the United States and the human smuggling, a lot of it is actually driven by groups that are not directly affiliated with any cartel. They just have to pay a fee to operate there. And then what you see is sometimes these rival cartels fight each other to control the plaza, to kind of control that. But in the aspect that you mentioned about the taxes and the levy, absolutely, we also see that as well. Where I would make a clear distinction, though, between what we see in let's say, the West Africa, or even let's look at Afghanistan with the Taliban, right? What you would see is during those insurgencies, these organizations would kind of set up a parallel government that did more than just taxation, right? They would have their own court system, and they would leverage Sharia law, right? In these specific examples, right? But they would have their own independent court system. They would have their own political leaders that were kind of rivals to whatever national government leadership was there. And it was kind of this battle, but there was kind of this parallel state government that these insurgent groups in Africa or the Middle East or South Asia would set up to challenge the authority of the local government, right? Or either challenge it or be a competition to them. In
Well,
Mexico,
in that case, I think Boko Haram would be a better example
correct.
than JNIM.
Then yes, right. Any of these type of groups I would agree with, right? And so when we're looking though at Mexico, that parallel government doesn't exist. And what you actually see is the cartels, the main tool they have to influence Mexican politics is through corruption. Right, because I think the Mexican cartels understands, like, look, we can't replace the government for all the services that require. Yeah, the Mexican cartels are one of the largest employers in Mexico. The last study was, if you look at Mexican cartels as a holistic organization, one organization, they were like the fifth largest employer, right? And obviously they have a huge amount of economic interest inside of Mexico. But how they kind of gain their influence would be more associated and tied with in this aspect of corruption because they require that local government support. And now you're running into this very interesting issue that I know we can probably talk kind of corruption and how that falls into. But the last estimate we got that I saw was that about a third of Mexicans' territory was under direct control of Mexican cartel, right? And that's a very high figure. Most of those areas are generally more remote, where the Mexican government's reach is minimal or almost non-existent, and so the kind of cartels kind of supplant those state organizations. But besides it, but they supplant them because they don't really exist, but they still have some sort of local political figure that's in charge that basically is paid off by kind of a cartel. And so that's kind of something that I would kind of make that distinction in the political sense, that the Mexican cartels understand that they can't necessarily replace who's ever in charge, but they might, if they're not in favor of whoever's in charge, either they assassinate or support a political rival so that they get in benefit. And then you run into a situation like in a local election where one political candidate is supported by one cartel, another political candidate is supported by a rival cartel, and then the associated violence that kind of ties in with that, right? But there's never an attempt really, like we've never seen Maito Flaco, the son of Mayo Zambada, say, I'm now the governor, let's say, of Sinaloa. That's never going to happen. Or even Ivan Archibaldo, the head of Los Chapitos, the undisputed leader of Los Chapitos, he's never going to replace either the Culiacan local government or the Sinaloa government. But what is known is that both the Culiacan leadership and the leadership in Sinaloa, especially at the governor level and the local level, are directly been corrupted by Los Chapitos. That is a well-known fact, that even a lot of times the state and local police were accused of supporting Los Chapitos, right? And so, that's kind of an interesting aspect that I can go more into detail a little bit further in this episode. But to your question about kind of retaliation, I think it's important to highlight one thing again, and it very much ties into this point I was making earlier right now about governance. So a clear example, I'm just going to lay it out for an example, right? In 2023, January 2023, one of the sons of El Chapo, Ovidio Guzman, who was one of the leaders of Los Chapitos, he was detained by the Mexican military. But when he was detained, and this was the second time it happened, what Los Chapitos did in response was basically try to stop the Mexican government from seizing him. And so what you saw was this very, very high level of violence that impacted Culiacan. And everybody thought, well, is this an attempt by Los Chapitos to conduct a retaliation because he was captured, right? And Culiacan became a war zone, a high level war zone. But I think that misunderstands how cartels operate, right? And you see this very regularly. You'll see reports of narco blockades and shootings in cities. And there's this idea of, oh, this is the cartels retaliating because a leader was captured, a capability was lost. And that's not how that works. What happens is, let's say the Mexican military wants to capture somebody, a key cartel leader. And it's generally when it's a leadership, you see this. They'll go in and they'll try to target this leader. The cartel that the leader is part of will realize, oh shit, the Mexican government's coming after us. We need to stop them. How do we stop them? Two ways. One, and this is where we see what people think is retaliation is the violence is not retaliation. There's one way they do this. They cause the city to be overrun with violence because the idea is there's either two ways that they could achieve this. Either the violence is so high that then the Mexican security forces are diverted to try to quell the violence, or that if the guy is captured, the violence is so high, which is what we saw when Ovidio Guzman was first captured in 2018, that the violence is so high and the gunmen control the city that the Mexican government is forced to release the person so that the violence can stop, right? And that's what we see. We see the Mexican military come in, the police, they go in, they capture guys, violence skyrockets. But when does the violence end? The violence ends either when the leader manages to escape or is released because the violence is too much for the Mexican government to handle, or two, when that leader is captured and then removed from the area. And then there's no doubt at that point that that cartel leadership is in custody of the Mexican government. And so the violence basically stopped because then it goes back to this previous point. If the violence cannot let my leader escape or force the Mexican government to get released, now we're going to go. Then the cartel says, let's go the legal route. And that's when you see the lawyers that represent a cartel figure basically representing their defendant and saying, look, the Mexican government captured this guy, but as you can see, and they try to find any technicality they can to allow him to get released. And they use the Mexican legal system to achieve that. And that actually has been successful. And in many cases, it's because of corrupt judges, right? Judges that are on the payroll of cartel members. That because the violence couldn't get them out, then they go the legal route and enable this person to escape and get released from custody by a judge order. Because they say, okay, prosecutors, you failed to do the search warrant properly, or I didn't find probable cause. So you are now ordered to release him. And then he's released. That's why when you see Mexican cartel leaders get extradited to the United States, there's nothing the cartel. It's not like you're El Chapo was extradited to the United States. Mayo Zambada, the leader of the Mayo Zambada organization, is in the United States. We don't see cartel members conducting the United attacks inside the United States because they understand you're done, right? And even sometimes when they're detained inside of Mexico, what they try to prevent is, well, if I can't get him released, I'm definitely going to do everything I can to prevent my leader to getting extradited to the United States. Because the moment they know that that leader is extradited to the United States, that cartel leader loses all power and influence within Mexico. Because even sometimes cartel leaders inside Mexican prisons can still have influence. It's diminished, but they can still control certain operations or sometimes all the operations still, right? But it kind of I think if you analyze it from that perspective, things kind of make more sense, and it kind of goes away from this myth of, and I think this is kind of like this Hollywood-esque mindset of a cartel leader is detained, and then you have these like very famous like law enforcement movies or shows where, oh, this guy was detained, so we need to attack this convoy inside the United States, or we need to kill this prosecutor inside the United States to release him. That doesn't happen. right? That's not how the cartels operate. If they can't get the guy released because of violence in the moment the operation happens, we use the legal system, and we either use the legal system legitimately or through corruption to order that person's release. And that ties into this earlier point that I was making, that the Mexican cartels have a vested interest in maintaining a lot of the state organizations that ensure that the government continues to function, especially the judiciary, because it's yes, you might get judges assassinated. Yes, you're going to get lawyers assassinated. Of course, that's always going to happen. But in the grand scheme of things, it's not really designed necessarily to replace it, but to behold the interest. And so, if you can corrupt a judge to do your bidding, that's how you're going to do it, rather than trying to set up your own independent court system. Because cartels don't have that; they just execute their rivals on whatever charges they invent. They release an execution video and then move on from there.
So what I'm hearing from you though is pretty much that it is terrorism. Like a lot of this is politically motivated. It is designed to control or influence the political system and the legal system, but it seems to be more complex than what you see from other terrorist organizations. It's less ideological and it's more about like the underlying politics.
So let me use a specific example. The CGN leader of Michoacan, I believe it was last month. He was the CGNG leader of Michoacan. He was the Mexican military launched an operation against him. And so, in the areas that he was operating, violence skyrocketed immediately with the operation. And generally, what you see is, how do you know a leader is getting targeted? Is because you see the classic, what we call narco blockades. Basically, they burn down vehicles and trucks and they block the highways with those burned vehicles, right? And so it basically prevents and ingress and egress routes. And then it forces the Mexican security forces to kind of divert to stop that, okay, we need to secure this area, et cetera. So when the GA leader was detained, when they were going after him, violence skyrocketed. Shootings, narco blockades, business was burning, businesses were attacked. And it wasn't necessarily per se as a form of retaliation, but it was to enable either his escape or force the Mexican government to release him because the violence was too high. What happened was the Mexican government successfully captured this leader, sent him to prison, and then the moment that he was sent to a prison, the violence stopped. You didn't see CGNG rushing to the prison. That didn't happen. Then what happened was, okay, now since we failed through violence to achieve our objective, we're going to go the legal route. And through a judge that, for all intents and purposes, was probably corrupted by the CGNG, the judge ordered his release, and he was released into the population, right? And there's so many of those examples that occur. And it's to your point, I think that the where the terrorism kind of becomes a little bit convoluted is I think the focus is a political end, right? It's terrorism is using violence to achieve a political end. The end is not political. It's obviously more. We talked about this in the first episode: greed versus grief, right? It's obviously greed, but they use political methods as well to achieve their goals, which is something very unique, I think, when we're analyzing kind of from a security perspective internationally. And I think that's an important distinction, but you highlight something very important. It's very convoluted and difficult, but that's how these organizations operate, right? And again, you're never going to see the CGNG leader in Michoacan try to declare himself the governor of Michoacan. That's not what he's going to do. He has no interest in doing that. He needs the Michoacan government to do his bidding. But if he has to use violence to solidify his economic interest, he will. But more than likely, they would rather leverage political means as well. And how this kind of comes to phrase when you're looking at kind of cartel propaganda, when they release video statements, a lot of times it's geared towards people in power to address issues that affect them directly. So let's say you operate in Guanajuato, right, a state in Mexico and central Mexico, one of the most violent, if not the most violent state in Mexico right
For the record, I do not operate there.
now. But let's just pretend you are a leader or a member of CG&G who operates in Guanajuato. One of your rivals there is called the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel, right? And you know that the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel has on their payroll a certain government official that operates in the town, that you want to expand control of. Let's say Salamanca, right? And this is just all pretend, right? What you will see the CGNG leader do is they will release a video statement directed at that person saying, at that local official, like, I know who you are. I know who you support. These are the people under your organization that are paid by the Santa Rosa Lima cartel, our rival. And you're basically on notice. And even sometimes what they'll do in these video statements is that they will appeal to either a governor or more, even to the president of Mexico directly in these video statements saying, this political leader at this local level supports this cartel. You need to address them. You need to go after them because they're corrupt local officials supporting our rivals. And so there's almost in many aspects you don't see cartels or either directly. It's extremely rare, if not non-existent. You never will see a Mexican cartel say, I'm going to overthrow the Mexican president at the federal level. What they'll do is they'll appeal to the president to address corruption at the state or local level that prevents them from getting more business or more power in that area or more territory in that area. And that's kind of this very interesting aspect that kind of ties in corruption, right? And a lot of the examples that I highlighted is this aspect of corruption being basically the cartel. I think there's two ways you can look at corruption. There's this idea of cartels paying off politicians to serve the cartel interests. So in other words, the power of the corruption lies within the cartel. That absolutely exists. But there's another aspect of corruption that I don't think gets enough attention. And it's when it's the other way around. Another word, a powerful, corrupt federal, state, or local official, he is the person that has the power. And he leverages cartels to either serve that corrupt politician's political or economic interest, right? So, but the thing is that the power of the corruption is at the political leadership level, not at the cartel. And so then that political figure then can tell the cartel, you are going to maybe assassinate my political rival. You're going to assassinate this journalist who's investigating me. Or you're going to make sure that maybe this town ensures that they're loyal to me. Or I just want money, so give me kickback to any profits you make. And if you don't, I have the military or I have the police loyal to me. And if you do not do as I say, I'm going to send them after you, and then you're going to lose power. And you're not going to be able to operate in this plaza. And it's almost has this interesting aspect where it's almost like the criminal overlord is the politician that can dictate to the cartels the terms of what they're going to do to operate in that area because he has the control of the military political organs or the state power to serve his own interests. And if that cartel fails to abide by his or her rule, he could just go to a rival and then support that rival to eliminate that cartel. And so that again highlights the complex nature of corruption in Mexico and kind of this dynamic in it, where you have two two kind of broad organizations, the political level at the federal, state, and local level, and then you have the various cartels operating, and the web and intricacies and who controls what and where does the power lie within a dynamic of a multiple conflicts impacting Mexico at once. And as you were, I think, alluding to in your question, it's a very complex issue that requires analysis of each almost either locality or state separately to try to build a holistic picture.
I mean, that is an excellent point. And one of the things that I think maybe we could expand on here is just how much money is tied up in these organizations. So we have estimates of, $6 to $8 billion tied up in cocaine and, almost $5 billion in meth. And that is just talking about CJNG. That is an insane amount of money that they're bringing in year after year.
Oh, I mean, the Mexican financial markets and banking systems heavily rely on cartel money to be solvent in many aspects, right?
So do the banks.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I even tell people like, if you want to analyze Mexican cartels, you know, there's a way they operate in Mexico and there's a way they operate in the United States. And what I would tell people, yes, in the United States, you have your like the Sicario movie, right? Your gunman, your your bad guys with guns and the enforcers, etc. Yeah, of course that exists inside the United States, but that's not what I would tell people. If you're wanting to imagine what a cartel member in the United States is, that's not I want you to imagine. Who do I want you to imagine is the banker, the lawyer, the businessman, the car dealership, for example, that serves as money laundering operation, that serves as a financial um, conduit for cartels. In the United States, it's all about profit, profit, profit. And the people that get employed, that get paid off by these criminal organizations in Mexico to do their bidding in the United States, in many cases are not your typical military-age male with guns. It's your normal, regular, male or female American citizen that either is trafficking drugs from Mexico into the United States or trafficking weapons from the United States to Mexico, or it's a business that operates to do money laundering that then is tied into either remittance companies or banks to launder the money so then the cartels can leverage it. I mean, it's a very sophisticated operation in the United States. That is the key aspect. It's kind of that financial transactional aspect of how
Well, and
cartels operate.
that's the thing about, like, if we're looking at these deportations, like the people who have more power are not the ones who have, the tattoos on their arms or chest or face. They're people who are operating what appear to be legitimate businesses. And this just seems like a very easy way to sweep up people and make it look like something is being done. But you've
I
got
mean,
to
the
look
vast
at the bankers.
majority, yeah, the vast majority, for example, of drug traffickers that get caught by CBP smuggling drugs into the United States are actually U.S. citizens. And it makes sense. Who do you think is going to get less attention from CBP? A guy with tattoo in their face, or a normal 35-year-old, you know, blonde woman with blue eyes and a baby in the back of their car?
Exactly.
That. I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, these cartels are multi-billion-dollar industries that, if they were legitimate businesses, would be in the Nasdaq Stock Exchange. CJ&G, without a doubt, is the most international transnational criminal organizations that exist to this day. It far surpasses the triads, the yakuzas, the Russian mafia, the Albanian mafia, the Italian mafia. It's CJ&G. We've seen CJ&G operations being busted in Kenya, in India, in Europe, right? And it's just not CJ&G. It's almost every single cartel has some level of international presence, even the Sinaloa cartel, right? But CG&G is a clear example of this international reach, where the that level of violence and control that CG&G requires, that violence gets exported to these other countries, right? Like, for example, Ecuador, the violence that we saw in Ecuador with gangs. Yes, there was a lot of domestic gang violence and warfare that can be and has to be analyzed locally. But there was definitely a component of that violence was also an exportation of violence of CG&G and the Sinaloa cartel trying to maintain control of Ecuador's ports because of the Pacific cocaine route into the United States, the maritime routes. And where CG&G and the Sinaloa cartel basically the violence that they were suffering in Mexico was exported to Ecuador, supporting rival gangs. We've seen it in Colombia. We've seen it in Venezuela, right? And it's that, and I think that's what people need to understand, is kind of this international reach that is not just limited to Mexico. But I also want to make it abundantly importantly clear that I don't want people to misconstrue that power and reach with this idea that cartels are able, even if, let's say, the cartels had a stated effort, they wanted to overthrow the Mexican government, they don't have the capability to do so. Right. And it gets to this idea where I have issues when we're seeing studies about Mexican cartels and maybe U.S. military action in Mexico. You'll hear this idea of where cartels are a more powerful force than what we faced in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. And I'm sorry, that's plainly false. I mean, ISIS literally had tanks in their arsenal. Tanks, T-55s, T-72s, you name it. They had armor personnel carriers. Cartels don't have that, right? And and
I,
and this is also the differentiation, I think, between greed and grief, because they don't have that political component of it. I mean, ISIS could literally send thousands of people to their death for a political ideology, a religious ideology, without question. You're not going to see that with these Mexican cartels. So even if a cartel wanted to overthrow the Mexican government, they don't have the capabilities to do so. Right. And I think that's something that's kind of important to highlight, that we need to kind of understand the power of cartels, but not overestimate it. And I that's where I think really that needs to be analyzed, because again, CJNG is very good at releasing propaganda videos of showing this intense level of power, but that's their messaging. And the reality is not the videos they release; is the kind of the videos that I see on a daily basis of them engage in firefights. They don't have the training, or necessarily, yeah, they might have more advanced weaponry. Don't get me wrong, than a lot of times the Mexican military, but they're not trained. And also, I think it's important to highlight that the Mexican government makes military decisions, and how the Mexican militaries operate in Mexico, based on public perception. You know, if you talk to a Mexican soldier, they'll tell you, "Hey, the cartels outgun us. We need more equipment." But the equipment that the Mexican military has that can easily address this problem, and let me make it clear, 90% of the times I see cartels engaging the Mexican military, even police, the cartels get absolutely decimated. Yes, you have cases of significant casualties in the Mexican military security forces side, but for the most part, it's the cartels that suffer more casualties than the security forces. But the capabilities that the Mexican, specifically the military, has that would easily address a lot of the problems that the Mexican army runs into are not employed, like their armored personnel carriers, like their tanks, etc. And the reason why the Mexican government doesn't employ those equipment is because they of this public perception. I mean, this is something that the Mexican government, since the war on drug was declared with President Calderon, all the way to now with Scheinbaum, they always try to argue violence is going down, everything is hunky dory, we're good to go. And so that's why the Mexican military doesn't deploy their armored personnel carriers to streets, or their tanks, because if they were to do that, they can't have that messaging campaign anymore. Like, it's hard to believe already, but it would be even worse to believe if you see armed tanks rolling down Mexico City, or Zacatecas, or in Sinaloa, right? And that's why there's also this own decision that the Mexican government does to limit what the Mexican military can use to prevent this public perception, because they have a lot more capabilities they don't employ. Because again, the Mexican government's interest, from a political sense, as a political party, is to send this messaging of violence is down, we're good to go, even though it's plainly obvious. But a lot of times, the Mexican military is the ones that suffer from those political decisions.
And then you sometimes do see them utilize things like the Black Hawk helicopters with, I think it was a MG-42. Um, but the other thing I would say is that there seems to be this misconception of Los Zetas, which were former special forces. That is not the same as CJNG.
Well, the leadership was, but again, that doesn't mean the gunmen are, and the members. Again, it goes
And
back
that's the
to,
most important part, right?
correct. There's this idea of, so the Zetas used to be former Mexican special forces, and they became an enforcer of the Gulf Cartel, and then they flipped on them, and then the huge violence. And there's this idea, oh well, the Zetas were former Mexican special forces. Yes, but not all of them. The vast majority of them were just locals, especially the air. So the kind of the successors of the Zetas are the CDN, the Northeast Cartel, based out of Laredo, Tamaulipas, Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, which borders Laredo, Texas, right? Got it. Yes, you have former Mexican special forces, still met former Mexican soldiers. You have Colombians, military personnel. You even have Americans in any country. Former military from any country is in Mexico in one way, shape, or form, either fighting or training with cartel members. That happens. But that doesn't translate that the entire force is like that, or they at the level of a Mexican special forces. And I think that's a misconception, gets it pushed a lot. People hear Zetas, former Mexican special forces. Yeah, the leadership and some of the key members and the gunmen, but not all of them. And it kind of goes back to this tier aspect of how cartel operates. Generally, within a cartel, the vast majority of the gunmen that belong to a cartel are just normal, you can even see videos of children, like 15-year-olds, up to 30, 35-year-old gunmen who have minimal training, who are just given either an AK-47 or an M82, an M16 or an M4, and told to fight with minimal training. right? That's the vast majority of them. But you do also have certain groups and factions that you can tell, okay, these guys are either better trained and better equipped. And I wouldn't use the term they're equivalent to special forces, but you can tell that they have better training and better equipment. And that can also be a problem, right? A perfect example of this would be the leader has been detained, but they used to be called Los Ninis, which he was the head of security for Los Chapitos. Those guys you can clearly tell, yeah, they received more training, but they were a small faction within the overall organization of Los Chapitos, right? And I think that's something that people need to understand when you're analyzing a cartel. It's a pyramid, but what you have to analyze, it's tiered by levels where you have the leadership, but then you have the faction leaders under the cartel. So the CGNG, for example, is led by El Mencho, but he relies on his lieutenants that have control of key factions. For example, los jardineros, which in English means the gardeners, because the leader of that faction is called el jardinero. That's his nickname. So he owns a faction of CGNG called los jardineros. Typical average, guys with guns, nothing really special about them. You have the elite group, Grupo Elite, which now you can maybe make an argument, okay, those guys might have better protection, and we've even seen reporting that some of them protect the leadership of CGNG, right? But then you have Grupo Delta, right? And you can keep on going and going down all the different factions, and you can kind of tier them, but that's really when you're analyzing a cartel, I think it's yeah, you have the leadership, but you also have to analyze the factions under the cartels, because sometimes those factions are the ones that break off and that causes violence to go up, because they break off to either form their own cartel or they join a rival. And you see that as well. The Sinaloa cartel was basically a split between the Maito Flacos and the Chapitos, and that's what caused the civil war. But a better example would be in Sonora, where before the Sinaloa cartel civil war, within Los Chapitos, we saw certain groups under Los Chapitos, specifically, let's say, Los Cazadores and Los Salazars, that used to be part of Los Chapitos. They broke off and formed kind of a loose umbrella organization called the Independent Cartel of Sonora. They were gunmen loyal to Los Chapitos who broke off and have been fighting a multi-year war now with Los Chapitos in Sonora. And that's why you have to also analyze the factions underneath the cartel to have a better understanding of how they operate.
So the cartels are basically a pyramid scheme like Herbalife.
You, that's a perfect example, I guess.
Uh, so one last question for you, before I let you go. Do you think that there has been some sort of leak or improvement in intelligence when we're talking about the United States or Europe, tracking the cartels and making these massive seizures?
So I wouldn't necessarily say the cartels, because people are gonna kind of associate that with Mexico, and I can't really make that confirmation. What I can say is we have seen significant drugs. I mean, 2024 was already a record in drug seizures, and 2025 looks like it's going to surpass that. And I think one of the main differences, I mean, this is an argument that can be made, was this because drug production is going up, or is there something else? I'm leaning towards the belief that at least in South America, because a lot of the drug seizures that we're getting reported, specifically by our European Union partners, and specifically even France, but even with the United States, and even a lot of these Central and South American countries, even in Mexico, we are seeing a significant increase in drug seizures. And there's a part of me that believes that at least at certain elements from the production and to the distribution level in these international drug trafficking organizations or transnational criminal organizations, a code has been cracked, because it wasn't common to see, record seizures of like 5, 6, 7, 8 tons of cocaine seized that much in a yearly basis. And in this year, we've already had close to a dozen examples of multi-ton cocaine seizures occurring, specifically in the maritime routes, right? And
Well, and
then,
there was that one in Italy that was like
yep.
200 or
And actually,
kilograms, kilograms.
there was almost 2,000 kilograms in a container. I know Kash Patel, the FBI director, even released a tweet that this was off the coast of Italy, and he highlighted the role of the FBI and CBP. right? And I think that that does indicate that at certain, and we don't have obviously access to insider classified information, so we have to kind of look at it holistically, but it does indicate that at certain elements within at least South America, probably in Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, a code has been cracked, enabling for more effective interdiction operations. And you can even kind of associate and tie that. We had this conversation with Austin in our previous episode where some of the violence in Colombia can be indirectly tied to these record drug seizures, right? And I think that's something that's important to highlight. But Matthew, before I do leave, I do want to leave our listeners with something I think is kind of important, and I'm hoping that in our next cartel segment, we can have an expert that really knows about this because I think it would be interesting to talk about. And that's kind of the roles of these Brazilian gangs, and I think gangs is kind of misnomer at this point. Um, Brazilian gangs, specifically the ones that operate in Rio de Janeiro, are definitely gaining power and influence. And what I would tell people is if you look at the history of Mexican cartels, when the Guadalajara cartel it was established, it was an undisputable fact that really the cartels that were in power and in charge were the Colombian cartels. And that the Mexican cartel was basically beholden to the Colombian cartel. And that's very classic in the 80s and 90s. But when the Colombian cartels kind of lost their power and influence, the Mexican cartels took over, right? What I would tell people is if there's a situation where the Mexican cartels start losing power and influence, just as the Colombian cartels did, where I would be looking to be the next, dominant organized crime group that operates internationally would be Brazil. I mean, there's a multitude of gangs, the Red Commandos, TCP, PCC, these groups that operate in Brazil, they're gaining power, they're gaining influence, and they're gaining reach. Specifically in Western Africa and in Europe, we're seeing more and more cases of Brazilian gangs. And I think that's some area that in the next 5 to 10 years, I think our listeners really should look into. And it would really be tied to if we see a degradation of Mexican cartel capabilities. Right now, I think it's pretty clear because of the situation with the Sinaloa cartel and the civil war they suffered that the predominant powerful Mexican cartel right now is CG&G. At least from an international perspective, I think it's important to highlight that in certain areas, CG&G inside of Mexico is losing territory to their rivals, specifically the Maito Flaco. In Zacatecas is a clear example where the Maito Flacos clearly has gained more territory. But as a whole, as an organization, and holistically, CG&G is on the rise. I would probably make an analysis is that as a whole, if we see Mexican cartels lose power, the next area we would see and focus and should focus on would be Brazil. And I hope that the next cartel episode we have a Brazilian expert on these gangs because I think that's a very fundamental and key conversation we should have.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that it's impressive the reach that these organizations have. I would love to discuss West Africa and how that plays into what we're seeing in the drug trade. Europe would be another great example. And I'll just leave with this. All Source News is the best source I have come across when it comes to Mexican cartel activity. So we will include a link to his Twitter, but make sure you follow him. And if you're interested in this information, that I cannot think of a better source than his Twitter feed. So thank you so much for joining us, and we will talk to you next week.